Around 9 o'clock on Saturday the 25th of May 1940, a deputation of locals carrying white flags made their way through the British lines. They were taken to see Brigadier Claude Nicholson, the commander of around 1,000 British troops of the British 30th Infantry Brigade, which had been tasked with holding Calais against the German advance. The deputation consisted of local officials and dignitaries who had found themselves in the hands of the Germans. They were led by the town's mayor, André Churchill, who had been instructed to persuade the British to surrender. The mayor pleaded with Brigadier Nicholson that if they did not surrender, the Germans would bomb and shell the town until nothing was left. Nicholson was unimpressed. He had the mayor detained within the citadel in Calais, which he was now using as his headquarters, and he instructed the remainder to return to the German lines, telling them,
"Surrender? No, I shall not surrender. Tell the Germans that if they want Calais, they will have to fight for it."
By 10 o'clock, the Germans had resumed their attack upon the town. Soon afterwards, Nicholson received a telegram from Anthony Eden, the Secretary of State for War, which read,
"The defense of Calais is of vital importance to our country, to the BEF, and as a way of showing our continued cooperation with France. The eyes of the whole empire are upon the defense of Calais. His Majesty's government is confident that you and your gallant regiments will perform an exploit worthy of the British name."
Men from the 1st Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, the 2nd and 7th Battalions of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, plus a detachment from the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment and the Royal Artillery, formed the British 30th Infantry Brigade, which had been shipped straight into Calais from Britain only a few days before. The British aimed to delay the German advance long enough to provide British and French troops to the northeast sufficient time to withdraw within the prepared defences around Dunkirk. At around midday, the Germans made another offer to the British to surrender. Again, Nicholson rebuffed their suggestion, saying,
"The answer is no, as it is the British Army's duty to fight as well as it is the Germans."
The German bombardment increased throughout the day, while from just outside the harbour, Royal Navy ships bombarded German gun emplacements. And so the battle continued all day, with bombardments, counter-bombardments, and street fighting along the northern edge of the town. By late afternoon, the Germans realised that they would not be able to capture Calais that day. That evening, Winston Churchill sent a personal telegram to Brigadier Nicholson.
"Every hour you continue to exist is of the greatest help to the BEF. The government has therefore decided that you must continue to fight. I have the greatest possible admiration for your splendid stand. Evacuation will not, repeat not, take place, and craft required for that purpose are to return to Dover."
This was a painful instruction for Churchill to give, and one that weighed heavily upon him. But he felt it was necessary to buy the BEF as much time as possible. Senior commanders in London had observed that Germany's Army Group A, which had raced to the coast along the Somme Valley, had not advanced further in the last 24 hours. Their efforts appeared to be directed towards the capture of Calais. At around 8 o'clock that morning, those same senior officials in London received a short but succinct message from Brigadier Nicholson. He reported that his men were exhausted, their last tank had been knocked out, water was short, and reinforcement was probably futile. The Germans had now captured the northern edge of the town, while the remaining garrison remained under relentless bombardment by both German artillery and Stukas. At 9 o'clock, the British War Cabinet met in Downing Street. Winston Churchill, the newly created Conservative Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, the leader of the Conservative Party, Lord Halifax, the Conservative Foreign Secretary, Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, Arthur Greenwood, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, and also attending was Archibald Sinclair, the leader of the Liberal Party. They were faced with the responsibility of making possibly the toughest decision ever undertaken by British politicians. 6 men from 3 different political parties and with different ideological views were required to come together to make a momentous decision on behalf of the British people. Simply, should Britain continue with the war, or should it seek peace terms with Hitler? It would take 72 hours for this decision to be made, a decision that would fundamentally change the course of the war and world history. Two days earlier, on the 24th of May, Adolf Hitler visited the headquarters of the commander of Army Group A, General Gerd von Rundstedt. Breaking out of the Ardennes forest, Army Group A included a concentration of panzer divisions and corps under notable commanders, including Generals Heinz Guderian, George Hans Reinhardt, and Erwin Rommel. Swiftly they advanced along the Somme Valley towards the English Channel, cutting off British, French and Belgian troops in Flanders. However, on the 21st of May, Rundstedt's panzers, particularly Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, had faced an Allied counterattack in the area around Arras. This, in von Rundstedt's view, had exposed the potential weakness of panzer operations when they were far in advance of both the infantry and their supplies. Von Rundstedt had also been informed, probably incorrectly, by General Gunther von Kluge, the commander of Germany's 4th Army, that the effectiveness of his entire panzer force had already been degraded by up to 50%. Additionally, they were seriously short of fuel and ammunition. The tanks were in need of maintenance, and the panzer crews were exhausted. Also, ahead lay less favorable tank country, with the boggy, dike-filled area around Dunkirk. On the evening of the 23rd of May, von Rundstedt issued a catch-up order, under which all mobile forces were required to halt, allowing time for infantry and supplies to catch up. By around midday on the 24th, the panzer commanders had received von Rundstedt's order to halt, though no reason was given. Guderian objected, but was told that it had been endorsed by Hitler. Guderian, though, was allowed to continue with the siege of Calais. The fact that Hitler was involved in such a decision was unusual, but in this case, a disagreement had arisen amongst senior German generals. It was not just Guderian who had objected to the catch-up order, or as it became better known, the halt order. General von Bock, the commander of Army Group B, also complained. His army group was advancing, mainly with infantry, from the northeast through Belgium towards Dunkirk. However, his 29 divisions were being held up by British General Alan Brooke's deployment of 6 divisions on the northern left flank of the BEF. These well-trained and disciplined troops were now falling back in a controlled manner towards prepared defensive positions around Dunkirk. These positions had been pre-prepared by Lord Gort, the BEF's commander, in consultation with Anthony Eden, the Secretary of State for War, who had instructed Gort not to tell the French or the Belgians. However, to the south, on their right flank, the BEF was still in open country. Here, facing Germany's Army Group A, they were extremely vulnerable to an attack. The German Army Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and the Chief of the German General Staff, General Franz Halder agreed with von Bock's assessment that Army Group A was in a position to swiftly surround and destroy the BEF. Annoyed by von Rundstedt's decision and claiming that Army Group A had become too unwieldy with its 71 divisions, Halder issued an order for the German 4th Army to be transferred from Army Group A to Army Group B, thus enabling von Bock to complete the encirclement and destroy the Allied forces in northwest France. Von Rundstedt was unimpressed with this plan, and when Hitler visited him the next day, on the 24th of May, he made his displeasure clear to the Führer. Hitler, being totally unaware that such an order had been made, became angry that this had been done without his consent. Feeling that his authority had been challenged, he immediately overturned Halder's order and confirmed von Rundstedt's halt order. In doing so, Hitler had destroyed Germany's golden opportunity to completely annihilate the entire British expeditionary force. Hitler went further, giving von Rundstedt complete authority over when the halt order would be lifted. Following this, Hitler summoned von Brauchitsch, who endured one of the Führer's infamous and furious rants. In the meantime, Halder attempted to get around the halt order. He issued a cleverly worded message to both Army Groups A and B for the continuation or go-ahead of the attack towards Dunkirk. Being a go-ahead, it was not the same as an order, but it meant that the attack towards Dunkirk could resume, while von Rundstedt would not lose face by having his halt order overruled, and simultaneously, Hitler's order would also not be disobeyed. However, von Rundstedt refused to forward the message to his subordinate commanders, so at a time when there was a crisis boiling for the Allies in both London and Paris, there was also now a crisis in the German army. On the morning of the 25th, von Brauchitsch attempted to persuade Hitler to rescind the halt order. Hitler refused, telling him that the decision was to be made by von Rundstedt and by von Rundstedt alone. Consequently, the halt order remained in place for a further 2 days. Hitler's view on this matter had also been coloured by a telephone call on the 23rd of May from Field Marshal Hermann Göring. Göring claimed that his Luftwaffe could, as he put it, set the Channel ports ablaze, thus destroying British troops trapped in the encirclement. Hitler approved Göring's plan, believing the army would be saved additional casualties, yet the same result would be achieved. After his conversation with the Führer, Göring told Air Marshal Earnhardt Milch, his second-in-command,
"Our air force is to mop up the British. I've persuaded the Führer to hold the army back."
However, General Albert Kesselring, the commander of the Luftwaffe's Air Fleet 1, expressed concern at this instruction.
Bombing Rotterdam into the ground was one thing. Destroying the Channel ports and the British army is quite another. I have pointed out to Göring that modern Spitfires, which have recently appeared, are making our air operations difficult and costly.
But Kesselring's misgivings fell on deaf ears, demonstrating that Göring's lack of military acumen matched that of Hitler. Back in London on that morning of the 26th of May, Churchill updated the War Cabinet, blaming communication difficulties for the fact that neither General Maxime Weygand, the Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in France, nor General George Blanchard, the commander of Allied troops north of the River Somme, had been aware of Gaut's intention to withdraw the BEF to Dunkirk. Churchill assured the meeting that both these French generals had now been informed and understood the situation. However, it is likely that they still had the impression that the British were merely withdrawing within a prepared defensive position rather than intending to evacuate the troops from France. Churchill assured the War Cabinet,
"There is a good chance of getting off a considerable proportion of the BEF."
Diplomatic relations with France were now likely to become sticky, but Churchill reported that he was that day due to have lunch with Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister. His principal aim would be to persuade Reynaud that France should keep fighting But the general view of the War Cabinet was that neither France nor Belgium would be able to survive much longer, and so Churchill had already tasked the Chiefs of Staff to prepare a strategic evaluation of Britain's ability to survive alone. Admiral Dudley Pound of the Royal Navy, General Edmund Ironside of the Army, and Air Chief Marshal Cyril Newell of the Royal Air Force joined the meeting. Their assessment was that only around 45,000 troops could be evacuated from Dunkirk. If the remainder of the British Army was captured in France, it would be impossible to resist a German army that gained any foothold on British soil. However, they did believe that it would be extremely difficult for the Germans to achieve such a foothold if the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force both remained intact. It was at this point that Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, revealed a formerly unreported request from the Italian government. This had the previous day led to a meeting with the ambassador in London, Giuseppe Bastianini. The ambassador had stressed his country's position of neutrality and had stated,
"It is Signor Mussolini's sincere desire to find a settlement that would not merely be an armistice, but would protect European peace for the century."
Halifax had affirmed that this was also the British government's desire, and that any proposal to secure peace in Europe would be willingly considered. Bastianini ventured further.
"I would like to be able to inform Signor Mussolini that your government does not exclude the possibility of some discussion of the wider problems of Europe in the event of the opportunity arising."
Effectively, the Italian ambassador was trying to move the subject from a question of Italian neutrality to that of Italian mediation between the Allies and Germany. Halifax assured the War Cabinet that he had not committed to any course of action, but he told the War Cabinet,
"We have to face the fact that it is not so much now a question of imposing a complete defeat upon Germany, but of safeguarding the independence of our empire. We should naturally be prepared to consider any proposals which might lead to this, provided our liberty and independence are assured. If the Prime Minister is satisfied that matters vital to the independence of this country are unaffected, would he be prepared to discuss such terms?"
Churchill immediately replied that any peace achieved this way would lead to Europe being dominated by Germany, something that he could never accept, adding,
"I am opposed to any negotiations which might lead to a derogation of our rights and power."
Chamberlain felt that Italy was likely to issue an ultimatum to France, leading them to joining the war on Germany's side. And Clement Attlee pointed out that Mussolini was actually nervous about Germany becoming the predominant power in Europe. But Halifax continued to argue that Great Britain was not strong enough to face Hitler alone, and that there was no prospect of any help from the United States. At this point, Churchill adjourned the meeting so that he could meet with Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister, for lunch at Admiralty House. Paul Reynaud had flown to London that morning. He confided to Churchill that General Weygand's previous optimistic view had evaporated over the past few days. The French government view was that Germany was unlikely to attempt an early invasion of Britain. Rather, they seemed certain to strike towards Paris once they had completed their capture of the area around Dunkirk. Plans were already being prepared for the possible evacuation of Paris. Irrespective, Reynaud reaffirmed his personal undertaking to Churchill that, as allies of Britain, France would not make a separate peace treaty with Germany. However, there was always the possibility of him being replaced as Prime Minister by someone, probably Marshal Pétain, who would most likely call for an armistice. Churchill assured Reynaud that the United Kingdom was prepared to stand firm, preferring to go down fighting rather than being enslaved by Germany. He was confident in the British armed forces surviving a German onslaught, but, he warned, France must stay in the war. Reynaud confirmed that no terms had yet been offered by Germany. Reynaud then mentioned Italy, saying that he wanted to keep Italy out of the war. With 10 French divisions guarding the Italian border that could be used against Germany, Reynaud feared having to give territory to Italy to buy their neutrality. He then suggested that Britain might wish to hand over to Italy for this purpose Gibraltar and the Suez Canal. As the War Cabinet reassembled, Churchill immediately reported his meeting with the French Prime Minister. Seizing upon France's difficulty with Italy, Halifax proposed that an approach to Italy must be made and that he had confidence in Mussolini persuading Hitler to take a reasonable attitude towards the Allies. Churchill now had to be careful, as Halifax had considerable support amongst Conservative members of Parliament, many of whom still viewed him with an element of suspicion. Churchill had therefore, since becoming Prime Minister, ensured that he treated Chamberlain, who was still the leader of the Conservative Party, with a considerable amount of respect and generosity. Although Chamberlain had always followed a policy of appeasement, he now appeared to be moving away from Halifax's position. Playing for time, Churchill proposed that no decision should be taken about the Italian offer until it became clear as to how many British troops could be rescued from France. However, Halifax continued to press his argument, saying,
"If we get to a point of discussing terms which did not threaten the destruction of our independence, we would be foolish if we did not accept them."
But Churchill gained general agreement that this was a subject for later consideration and that the immediate focus must be on getting the maximum number of troops evacuated from France. With this, Churchill suggested to Halifax that he might like to meet the French Prime Minister, who was still at Admiralty House. This second meeting of the War Cabinet that day was adjourned, and later all members of the War Cabinet went to meet the French Prime Minister to discuss the possibility of a deal with Mussolini. Still to come in Part 2, Germany's Panzers once again advance and international diplomacy becomes increasingly desperate. Mussolini, having been duped by Hitler, becomes worried for his own country's safety. He therefore attempts to deliver France and Britain to Hitler. Meanwhile, Churchill is faced with his own foreign secretary, who appears to be becoming progressively more gullible over Mussolini and Reynaud's intentions. Could this endanger Britain's self-determination?